Good morning and welcome to Digging Deeper. I'm your host, Stephen Cuffle. We're here on Sundays at 10:30 a.m. Basically what we do is we take your questions and we find biblical answers to the things that you want to know. If you have a question, we open up the Bible, we see what it is that God is telling us, and we get God's answers straight from His Word so that we know what God thinks about any given topic. I would invite you to find us on columbuschurch.net/diggingdeeper, or you can find us on facebook.com/diggingdeeperradioshow. At either one of those places, you can find our previous programs. You can submit your questions or sign up for our podcast. I would highly encourage you to send in your questions so that we can make the best use of our time here together. What we're going to do today is we're going to interrupt looking at the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to focus on answering a question that has been asked in several different ways by a few people over the past couple of weeks. What it is people want to know about science and the Bible, or science and faith, and how those things, or if those things, fit together. And so we're going to talk about whether or not the Bible is based on science, and what that question means, and whether or not science plays any role at all in faith. So when we ask the question, is the Bible based on science? What we don't mean is, did science give us the Bible? Did science give us revelation? Revelation, when a religious person talks about revelation, what they're talking about is a conversation. That's all it really means. And it's a conversation between a divine being and mankind. So the reason why we call it revelation is because you can't sit down necessarily, or so to speak, next to God and talk with Him. So God reveals Himself or makes Himself known. Something that is normally not seen, a spiritual being like God, is made known or shown or revealed to us in a variety of different ways. The Bible would make the claim that God does this through the Scriptures, so through the Bible, and through creation. In fact, the Apostle Paul over in Romans chapter 1 would talk about how God makes His divine attributes and His divine power known through what has been made. So there's at least those two ways, through some kind of direct revelation like Scripture or the Bible, and through the creation, in which a religious person would claim that God is making Himself known or communicating with us. Well, communication isn't based on science. You and I communicating right now via the radio, it isn't happening because we're running some kind of experiment. When you sit down with somebody at a restaurant and you talk to each other across the table, that communication isn't happening through some kind of scientific process. But how you understand that communication does. Right? We would call it linguistics. So linguistics is the study of language. And you come pre-built or hardwired to understand language. The human brain has an amazing capacity to learn and understand language. It doesn't take very long. If you get plopped off in a foreign country with people whose language you don't share, it doesn't take you long to figure out what they're saying or figure out some way to communicate. So you come hardwired with a basic understanding of linguistics and communication. So the communication itself isn't based on science, but your understanding of that communication is based on some kind of science. So what we're going to have to define right at the beginning is, what do we mean when we say the word science? There's a lot of debate over what that word means, when it can be applied, how it can be applied, to what it can be applied, and we need to make sure that we have the same understanding for that word, that we're using it in the same way. So what does science mean? I'm a big fan of dictionaries. I love to look words up in the dictionary, so I've got the definition for science from the Concise Oxford English Dictionary. We're speaking English, and this dictionary comes from England, and so I think it's a really good source for what English words mean. So science is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. That is the primary definition. Another definition is a systematically organized body of knowledge on any subject. So you can have the science of love poetry. All you do is you take information about love poetry and you organize it in some systematic way, and now you have the study of that, or the science of that. And so that's how you'll wind up with many various disciplines in science. It also means, a very, very old usage of the word science just means knowledge. So anytime you had knowledge about something, you had science about it. In fact, you can see that in many of our words. Conscience is actually conscience, with knowledge. So what we're seeing is, it depends on how you're using the word science as to whether or not the Bible is involved in science, or science is involved in our understanding of the Bible. So let's just go with the primary definition. Right? Let's use that one and see if it's limited to things like acid-base titrations, those types of laboratory experiments. So is the word science limited to use for laboratory science? The only time you can ever use the word science is if you're talking about some kind of experiment going on in a laboratory. Is that the case? Well, let's see. So science is the intellectual and practical activity. That's how our definition starts. That means people are involved, because there's an activity. It's not just something that happens. Science doesn't just magically fall out of the sky. Science is something that people do. So that means that people are involved. And that's important for us to understand, because even if you're talking about laboratory experiments, where you design an experiment, you have around determining whether or not some kind of hypothesis is true or false, and you repeat the experiment 1,000 times, and you go through and you look at all the data you've gathered, and you derive some kind of conclusion based off of the data that you've gathered. It's important for us to understand that process, that activity, involves people. And so anytime you involve people, you're involving our intellect, you're involving our biases, you're involving our standards, our observational limitations. That people are involved in that process. So science isn't just taking raw data and saying, this is what the data says. Data doesn't speak. People do. And so what scientists do, whether you're talking about a laboratory science or some kind of other science that we'll get into in just a minute, what people do is they take data and they interpret that data. And so to say that science happens without human interpretation is just not true. People interpret data. There are good interpretations and there are bad interpretations based off a variety of logical rules and rational rules that we put in place. But no matter what you're talking about, people observe, people gather, people interpret data. So there's no scientific conclusion that is void of human personality. And you can see that throughout history when science changes, right? When what we know about the physical universe, when we gather new data and science begins to change, there's a lot of personality involved, because somebody who has spent their life coming up with some kind of hypothesis or some kind of theory doesn't want that overturned just overnight, right? So it's going to take time to deal with human personalities. And you see that a lot throughout history, where you have people coming up like Copernicus and Galileo, and they're working on the orbits of planets and refuting geocentrism. A lot of people want to say, well, that was science versus the church. It's not. It's not. The Galileo and Copernicus and a whole host of other scientists throughout history were religious people. They were members of a church. So it's not the church versus the science. It's scientists within the church arguing with each other. Scientists who are believers, let's put it like that, arguing with each other. Because whether we like it or not, people are involved in science. And anytime you involve people in a process, anytime there's an activity that have people involved in it, it gets messy. Or people aren't simple. People aren't just straightforward. We're very complicated, very difficult creatures to deal with. And so anytime people are involved, things get muddled and messy. So science is people-based. Whether we like it or not, it is. Science is also big. Notice our definition. It said the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study. So encompassing a systematic study. So encompass is a big word. And it encompasses an activity of a systematic understanding. These are all huge ideas, huge words. So science is really big. It's expansive. There is no narrow field that can claim exclusive rights to the term science. So if we want to limit it to laboratory experiments, well, which kind of laboratory experiments? What kind of laboratory observations? Is it just ones where you're mixing chemicals? So there's limited human involvement other than the portioning and mixing of the chemicals? Is it human observation, maybe putting rats in mazes and watching the rats? Which one of those is the correct type of laboratory setting? And so when we begin to start whittling down, you can whittle it down to where there's one type of science in one room with one person doing one type of experiment. And that's just not how the word works. It's a big, encompassing word. So science is big. And anytime you have a systematic study of something, that's our definition, it's a practical activity encompassing the systematic study of anything relating or pertaining to the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world, which is huge. Anytime you have something involved in that, you've got science going on. And so we can't limit this word to a very, very narrow field, to a very narrow understanding. Otherwise, we're taking away from the definition. And anytime somebody wants to narrow the definition of science down and say, oh, well, that's not science, they're probably wrong. Now, we could say that art isn't science. We can make a pretty good, I think, case that most types of art aren't science. Now, if we have that secondary definition, if we compile all kinds of artwork and systematically study them, do we have a science in that way? Yeah, sure, we do. But is there a hypothesis about art? Is there something about art that you're trying to prove or disprove other than maybe some people have no taste? Well, probably not. Right? Art exists as a form of expression of human idea and human emotion. And when we go back to our definition of science, yeah, people are involved in it, but science isn't about expressing human ideas or human emotions. It's about learning things about the structure and form and behavior of the universe that we live in. So is art a type of science? That second definition? Yeah, maybe. But that primary definition, no. Now, is art based on science? Or do you use science in art? Totally. You totally do. Right? Mixing colors, using different mediums, all of that stuff. There's all kinds of science involved in art. So to say that art isn't scientific is only true if you mean that we don't use art necessarily to try and figure out how the universe works. But to say that art isn't scientific and that it doesn't involve science, that's not true. All right, so science is people-based. It involves people. Science is really big. Science is really big. Science is also a process, right? When we go back to our definition, is the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical world. A systematic study just means looking at things with a method. You have a way that you go about doing it. You don't wake up one day and piddle over here and then wake up the next day and piddle over here. You have a structured methodology for going about what you're doing. That's a systematic process. And there are loads of books actually written about the Bible called systematic theology. So they're approaching it from a systematic way with a process, looking at various things. Anytime you're learning something, anytime you're trying to glean information, anytime you're trying to figure out how stuff works, systematic processes are the way to go. Because if you just guess over here and then do something else random over there, you're not going to get any type of good information, good reading, good data, unless maybe you're studying something like chaos theory. But even that's systematic in nature. So science is a process. Are you collecting data about rocks, quarks, fruit flies, the Russo-Japanese War? If you're collecting data about something and you have a methodical process that you go about doing it, then it's very likely that you're doing science. Wait a minute, did I just throw some history in there? Yeah, I did, because historians use processes to gather information. Anthropologists use processes to gather information. Archaeologists use processes to gather information. Geologists use processes to gather information about stuff that happened in the past. Geology is a historical science. Archaeology, historical science. Anthropology, historical science. History itself is a type of historical science. You are involved in the systematic process of learning about how the physical world, in this case, when you're looking backwards, not how it behaves right now, but how it behaved in the past. Somebody might argue, wait a minute, history focuses mainly on people. Yeah, it does. It focuses mainly on people and events. But aren't people part of the natural world? Aren't people and the events that we find ourselves involved in, isn't that part of the behavior of the natural world? Why is it okay to call studying orangutan science or studying fruit flies science, but not studying people science? If it's okay to study rhinoceri and call that science, if it's okay to study the migratory patterns of the hippopotami in Africa science, then it's okay to call studying people science too. Even though we have a different word for it, it doesn't make it not science, because we're doing all of these things, right? We have people who are applying their intellect on data that we have gathered in a systematic way to test a hypothesis. Well, there's no hypotheses, there you go. Not everything with an S gets an I on the end. Hypotheses in history? Yes, there is. In fact, that's how historians work. They come up with an idea, and they say, maybe this is the reason why the Russo-Japanese War happened. Maybe this is the reason why Custer lost the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And then they go and they gather data, and they test the hypothesis. And it's provable or disprovable. Just like in archaeology, in paleontology, in geology, right? These all have hypotheses that you gather data and then you try and prove or disprove, or you try and give weight to certain ideas and take weight away from other ideas. We have this grossly negligent idea that science is very cut and dry, and that just one fact proves everything. That's not the way science works. Science is an inductive process. Deduction, right? When you have deduction starts with universal laws. And you have this law, and you throw this law underneath that one, and you arrive at a singular conclusion that is necessarily arrived at based on a variety of universal truths. That's deductive reasoning. And if your universal truths are correct, if your premises are true, then the conclusion that you reach, if your logic is sound, is something that must follow. Right? It must follow. We call that an implication. It is something that is implied. It's more than maybe you might imply something in a sentence. It's more than that. It's a logical conclusion based off of some universally true statements. That's deductive logic. Science works with inductive logic. In other words, you don't know what the rule is. You're gathering data points, and then you look at all of these data points and you try and induce the universal truth. So you have all this data, and you're trying to arrive, based at all the different data points that you have, you're trying to arrive at a universal truth. So that's great as long as all your data points agree. Well, sometimes there's data that doesn't agree, and then you kind of have to alter your universal truth, this thing that you're trying to arrive at, this law that you're trying to achieve. And so science can only tell us what we think is a universal law. Based on everything we've seen so far, this is how gravity seems to work. And that's why gravitational theory is called theory. Now, the scientific word theory doesn't mean this is our best guess, right? We might say, I have a theory about who ate the cheese. And that's a guess, right? You don't know who ate the cheese. You just have a few, maybe inklings or maybe a little bit of evidence, and you have a theory about that. In science, a theory is based off of lots of data, lots of experimentation, lots of reasoning, lots of rational, logical thinking and conclusions. And so when something becomes a theory, there's a lot of force behind it. But we still call it a theory because we might learn something new. Right? We might learn something new about gravity next week. And all of a sudden, all these things that we thought were true about gravity aren't true anymore. And so ideally, that's how science works, is we have this idea, we gather data points, and if we find new information, we adjust our understanding. It doesn't always work that way because people, again, are involved in the process, but ideally, that's how it works. So science is a process based upon observation. When you look at it, this encompassing system of science gathers information through observation and experiment. Historians do that just like you would in a laboratory. It's just a different type of experimentation and a different type of observation. You have to go through and you gather all sorts of different sources. You look at the different sources. You compare the different sources. sources, you see the validity of the sources, and sometimes you have to invoke a whole array of different types of science in order to come to a conclusion. For example, a historian might invoke various types of chemistry or archaeology to see whether or not something is good evidence about a given theory or a given idea. For example, if we were to find a book that's supposed to be an original copy of Julius Caesar's The Gallic Wars, well, we might go back and we might test the ink to see if it matches the types of inks that the Romans would have been using. We might go back and test the material to see if it matched the type of material that they would have been writing on. There were different types of parchments, different types of vellum, different types of papyrus that might be used to come up. And does it match? Does it fit what we would have expected Julius Caesar to be writing on? Does the handwriting, does the type, the style of writing match what we would expect to see? And so those are all different types of things that we would use to determine whether or not this is a valid copy of the Gallic Wars. And then if we find out that it's not a valid copy, even then we can still learn stuff from it. So science, when it has a hypothesis and you disprove that hypothesis, that doesn't mean you throw out all the information. It just means that we're going to learn from this a different way than we thought we might. And so the same thing is true with history. And so what we're seeing is that this word science is expansive and it covers lots of different things. And so when we begin to ask the question, is our understanding of the Bible based on science? Well, does that mean our understanding of the Bible is based on experiments we run in a laboratory with acids and bases? No, that's not what we mean. In fact, there's very little in life that actually works for. There's some very powerful things that works with. Right? So we're not trying to say that that's bad stuff at all. It's great, but it has a narrow application. It isn't what makes everything tick. And so when we begin to ask questions, can we use science to understand the Bible? Should we use science to understand the Bible? The answer is yeah, we should. We totally should. Just not lab coats, goggles, and beakers, right? We're going to be using a different type of science. So history is science, anthropology is science, archaeology is science. But now what we want to know is history useful besides looking at the past? Because that's one of the things you want to do with science is you want to learn stuff and make predictions about the future. It's great that you can titrate acids and bases, but if that doesn't tell us anything about what's going to happen in the future, then it's not really useful. Is history useful as a science? And the answer is yeah, I think so. Have you ever heard anybody say that history repeats itself? Well, that's not true. History never repeats itself. Never, not once, it never has. Let's just stick with our Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905. That will never happen again. Russia and Japan might fight again in the future, or people from those two places might fight again in the future, but you will never have another Russo-Japanese War because that happened in 1904 and 1905, and Theodore Roosevelt brokered the peace and got the Nobel Peace Prize. Really cool stuff, but that's it. Right? It will never happen again. And so history happens once, and then you can go back and you can gather historical data, and you can use that data to make predictions about future events. And so you might see something, and people will say, "Oh, this is history. This is history happening all over again, repeating itself." I wouldn't say that. I would say instead, history predicted that these events were likely to occur again. Or history has shown us that when the conditions are right, these types of events are likely to happen. And that's how you use history as a useful science. It's not just learning a bunch of facts and figures about the past, although that can be cool. It's actually learning about how the past can help us predict actions in the future or can show us better ways to react to events in the future. Right? You'll hear people say sometimes, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Well, again, they're not going to repeat it. They're going to make the same kind of mistakes that people in the past have made. And so history is a useful science. Again, not beakers, goggles, labs, but it is a science and it is useful. And so when we begin asking questions about the Bible, is the Bible based on science, or can we use science to understand the Bible? The answer is yes, but maybe not the way that most people think. right? You can't run an experiment to see whether or not, a laboratory experiment with chemicals and beakers, you can't run that kind of an experiment to see whether or not the Apostle Paul really fought with wild beasts at a Colosseum in Ephesus. But what you can do is you can go to the site of ancient Ephesus and look for evidence of a Colosseum. Was there some kind of Colosseum there where people would be fighting, or an amphitheater is what maybe it would properly be called? Was there an amphitheater there where people would be fighting wild beasts? Is there evidence, historical documentation about those kinds of contests taking place in Roman colonies like Ephesus? And so we can gather all kinds of information and come to a conclusion about whether or not what the Apostle Paul says is likely true. Is it likely that he fought with wild beasts at Ephesus? Were people fighting with wild beasts at that place in the first century? The answer to those types of questions is yes. It's highly likely that he did. And so when you start looking at it like that, we're looking to prove things in a different way than running a laboratory experiment. So can you use science, laboratory science, to prove that God exists? Well, no. In fact, what you have to do is you have to gather evidence, and then you have to ply your intellect and come away with what you think is the best conclusion. Can you use laboratory science to determine whether or not the Bible is true, whether or not you have an unbroken string of revelation recorded and maintained throughout history? Well, not necessarily. You can look back historically and you can say, based on the evidence, do we have the copies of what was written in the first century? So when Paul authored the letter to the Romans, do we have exactly what he wrote, the letter to the Romans? And based on the evidence, the answer to that would be yeah, we do have what Paul wrote. Now, we don't have the original autograph, right? The original manuscript. We don't have the actual letter that Paul wrote, but do we have the same content? And historically speaking, the answer to that question is yes. Yeah, we do. We know we are more sure about the Bible than we are sure about having the correct content for William Shakespeare's plays. We are more sure for the content of the Bible than we are for Plato's, Aristotle's, and Socrates' philosophies. And so when you start looking at those types of things and comparing the historicity of the Bible, we have a lot of evidence that the Bible, that we have today, is actually what was written. And that's important. Because if we're going to start looking at whether or not the Bible is a revelation from God, we want to make sure that we've got the right stuff to talk about. And so when you start doing that, that's what we mean. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. We're dealing with experiments and hypotheses and gathering and collecting data, but they're different types of experiments than many people think of. And what happens, unfortunately, is modern television and art and drama and all of that make it seem like science is just a lab thing. Right, where you have crime shows where most of the detecting happens in a laboratory where somebody mixes a few bottles together and, oh, yep, the killer's guilty. It doesn't necessarily work that way, right? And human reason, human logic, human rationality enters into science in every realm, and not all science is laboratory science. So that's important that we understand that. So when somebody asks me, is the Bible based on science, or do you use science in religion? The answer is yes, you do. If you don't, then you're not really believing in or putting your trust in the things that have been revealed. You're just deciding what you like and what you don't like. And so when you start looking at religion, you're going to take science and you're going to apply it universally across the board. You're going to examine claims made by all different types of revelation. You're going to examine claims made by Mormons. You're going to examine claims made by the Catholic Church, by just the Bible itself, by the writings. The Bible doesn't claim anything. The authors of the Bible do. By the claims made by people like the Apostle Paul. You're going to examine all sorts of things. You're going to look at the historical context, the cultural context, the social context for things that are going on. For example, is Joseph Smith as trustworthy as the Apostle Paul? And so you would look at evidence and you would try and figure out answers to that question based off historical evidence. And so there's all kinds of things. It was David Koresh, a trustworthy individual. Well, you'd have to go back and gather evidence and look at what happened and see whether or not the Branch Davidians were a religious group on the same level as the Christians were in the first century. And so you have to gather information, you have to make observations, and then you have to apply human intellect, right? You have to use reason, you have to use logic, you have to use rationality. If you're not using human reason when you approach your faith, then you are leaving out the thing that makes you different from a dog or a cat. Right? Your ability to reason and think from a purely physical perspective is what sets you apart. And it's a shame if you don't use your reasonability to determine what it is that you believe. So we're about out of time. I would like to invite you back as we continue this discussion next time into the scientific basis or the rational basis for belief. Again, my name is Stephen Cuffle. This is Digging Deeper. You can find us at columbuschurch.net/diggingdeeper or facebook.com/diggingdeeper radio show. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to seeing you next week.